Alright, before we move on to the program that we're going to use to actually now read in the data from the file we just wrote to, I want to talk about a couple more things that were covered generally in your Zybook, but they're worth mentioning here. They're a little bit confusing, and I want to clarify a little bit. So the first thing is, you'll notice these extra couple of words up here after our declaration of our main method. And we're going to talk more about what this means later and how this is related to things that can go wrong when you try to open a file to read from it and things like that. But for now, all I want to tell you is if you're writing a program that deals with opening files, okay, file streams, to write to files or to read data from files, you just need to put these two words right after this main method, at the end of your main method declaration. Okay, and if you don't do that, I'll just even show you it real quick. If I delete that and save it and try to compile this, I'll get an error message that's saying, oh, there's some error occurred when you're trying to create this file stream thing, and it says unreported exception and some extra stuff in here that, again, you don't need to necessarily know what it means. Main thing is go, oh, okay, I forgot. I have to, anytime I'm opening up files, at least for now, what I need to do is I need to add those extra couple of words up here. And again, you can just look those up. Okay, they'll be in any of your example programs that you can look at. Just throws IO exception. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out. Okay, the second thing, probably a little more important, or I guess equally important, is that anytime you write a program or you open up a file to do something with it, read from it or write to it, okay, it's always good to close that file. And there are a few different reasons for this, but one of the main reasons for doing that is you want to make sure that everything actually does get actually saved in that file. And closing, in some sense, helps with that. So there's this little extra detail about what actually happens in a computer's memory as it's actually trying to write things to a file, so as this line is run. And it actually, instead of writing it directly into that file on the hard drive, it actually writes to what's called a buffer. And you don't need to totally understand this, but I thought I'd at least go through it quickly so you get the idea of why this closing and flushing is important. So it'll actually write to this kind of temporary place that's called a buffer. And then the computer itself will decide at some point in time, okay, now I'm going to take that information that you just put in that buffer and I'm going to actually save it on the actual hard drive in the file. So what closing does, or at least one of the things that closing does, is it actually attempts to force that information that was written into this little buffer to be saved into the file permanently before the program ends. So that's one good reason to actually always, at the end, when you're done with a file that you've opened up, close that file. Okay? It, again, partially just helps improve your chances that what actually is supposed to be written into that file will actually get saved into that file. There are times, if you don't do that, when you could actually, this program could run and it writes the information to this little temporary thing called the buffer, and then the program closes and it never actually saves it into the file. So you go look at the file and there's nothing there. Okay, and this other thing called flush, this is not always required, but I wanted you to see it now. It's a closely related thing. Flush is what actually forces that process that I just said to occur. So if you explicitly call this flush function on your file output stream, or actually your file writer, your print writer, it will actually force whatever's stored in that buffer, that temporary holding place, to actually be sent out to the file on the hard drive and saved there. So you can force that to happen by calling this flush method here, essentially, on that file writer. Okay, so close usually will work by itself, but if you ever run into problems and you've got your code running and it seems like everything's working fine, and then you go open up the file and what was supposed to be written there, wasn't there, sometimes that can have to do with this issue, and you may want to keep this idea handy, this method handy, and say, well, I could try that. Let's see if that's the problem. I can try flushing the buffer, it's called, which basically means take all that stuff stored in the buffer and send it out to the file and actually save it to the file. So something just to keep in mind in case you run into some problems where you're not seeing things get saved to a file that you expected